evening. I don't know. Can you hear me? I guess so, right? Okay. John has asked that I remind you of two things. The first is those who are uncomfortable that there's an overflow space set up downstairs with chairs. And secondly, that after tonight's lecture, there is a reception for Alejandro downstairs. So before you disappear, please take a moment to have a glass of wine and speak with him. So it's great to see such a big crowd. It's with great pleasure that I introduce tonight's lecturer, Alejandro Zaera-Polo, who's an architect, educator, and without a doubt, one of the most important contributors to contemporary architecture's conceptualization and production. A native of Spain, he studied architecture initially in Madrid, followed by graduate work at Harvard's Graduate School of Design. And after a brief collaboration with Rem Koolhaas, he established Foreign Office Architects with Farshid Mousavi in 1995. Developing and realizing the project that many of us associate with early Foreign Office work, the award-winning Yokohama International Cruise Terminal, from 1995 to 2002, Foreign Office are currently building internationally an office complex in London, an Institute of Legal Medicine in Spain, residences for artists and researchers in France, several high-rise residential towers in Korea, and thankfully, a museum of contemporary art in our own neighboring Rust Belt city, Cleveland. During this time, Zaera-Polo moved seamlessly and sharply through modes of inquiry and production, through writing, building, teaching, and leadership. And I'm just saying something briefly about each of those. It's been suggested Alejandro's early writing inaugurated a materialist critique that departed from the critical theory of the 1980s, influenced by complexity theory and the work of American design theorists Jeff Kipnis, Sanford Quinter, and Greg Lynn. He remains a prolific writer, publishing, and this is according to my cursory Avery search this afternoon, over 40 articles and essays since 1989, including a most recent one that intrigued me, Patterns, Fabrics, Prototypes, and Tessellations, where he argues that patterns have cultural and political possibilities far beyond decoration, enabling new practices to address some of the crucial problems posed by globalization, including the dichotomy between tabula rasa and contextual thinking, and the articulation between the local and the global. Through a two-part essay in the journal Log that many of you know of, entitled The Politics of the Envelope, which will be a conversation session in Princeton's lecture series early next week, he examines the building envelope as a reflection of technical, cultural, and political issues. Alejandro has published extensively as a critic in professional magazines worldwide, including El Croquis, Quaderns, A+U, Harvard Design Magazine, and has contributed to numerous publications such as The Endless City, curated by Ricky Burdett. Foreign Office's building projects are known for fascination with form and material, shifting through scale and amongst domains of urban design, architecture, and landscape. In a sequence of projects that has preoccupied me are those that design critic Bob Somol calls the first to extract and translate successfully the possibilities of landscape through the problematics of architecture. In their 1999 competition scheme for Downsview Park, the park's form is determined by the operation and intersection of its systems, providing a flexible infrastructure for change and adaptable use. Towards that end, the scheme evolves by the reorganization of topography into circuits and ridges that accommodate seemingly disparate uses from wildflower meadows to extreme sports. In Yokohama, building as object is suspended in favor of what has been called the thick 2D, a ground configuration replete with terminal uses and urban park, maximizing possibilities for urban interface in a section that is woven, not stacked. And a few years later, in Southeast Coastal Park in Barcelona, 2004, topographic manipulations guide both views and flows of people, protect from coastal winds to enable vegetal and human livelihood. The generative concept of dune morphology sponsors both diagram and detail, where a custom set of tiles laid in bifurcating rhythms and set in various inclinations sponsor vast programmatic potential. This hardly needs saying that the work of Foreign Office, those mentioned included, have been widely published, exhibited, and awarded. The office was represented Britain in the Venice Biennale in 2002. Finally, in addition to his theoretical and built contributions to our discipline and profession, Alejandro has a critical voice in architectural education. Dean of the Berlage Institute in Rotterdam until 2005, he now occupies the Berlage Chair in the Technical University of Delft. Prior to this, he was a unit master at the AA in London and a visiting professor at institutions internationally, most currently as a visiting professor at Princeton. Most important, perhaps, is the role he plays as architecture's advocate outside our institutions. He's currently a member of the Urban Age think tank at the London School of Economics and advisor to the Quality Commission for Architecture in Barcelona and the Committee for Urban Development in the city of Madrid. On a personal note, I've had the pleasure of meeting Alejandro on only one occasion, this fall during the Delphic Games in South Korea. Although he didn't pick our scheme as the gold medalist, I did experience later in the evening a greater prize, and that is Alejandro sings a mean karaoke. So please join me in welcoming Alejandro Zaera-Polo.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Julia. I was going to make the same joke about you. the last time I saw you, we were singing karaoke at 3 o'clock in the morning. Okay, so the presentation tonight is a very long presentation. It's a kind of compendium of reflections made in the last few years on the work of FOA and other inquiries that of a more theoretical nature that I've been doing and that I am now trying to develop in my visiting professorships in Princeton. And it's titled Envelopes. It relates to the articles published in Log and is basically my current line of research. The lecture is very long, so if at some point it gets too boring, just tell me to shut up. And I never know how to finish lectures, so they always die out of sudden death. So the investigation comes out of a reflection. It looks as if the screen is not picking up the full...
Yeah. Oh, you're not using this. Oh, okay.
Anyway, maybe it is good enough to talk about it. The investigation comes out of a reflection that I started doing a few years back that was aimed, thank you very much, was aimed at trying to regain something that I think the people from my generation, Julia was just saying, the generation of the early 60s, I think largely had abandoned, which was the idea of architecture as a political activity. I remember in my early days of teaching completely denying any sort of political engagement or political content of the practice, and recently I've become interested in retrieving part of that content, and the envelope work is in a way an attempt to find a domain where we can talk about architecture, but where we can also talk about politics in a very concrete manner. I think that one of the greatest potentials that architects have now that politics worldwide are shifting towards swing electorates and a type of politics that are no longer about party alignments and things like that, is precisely to retrieve a certain agency that we have been deprived of by starting to talk about architecture and reflecting about architecture in a slightly different way. And so some of this research that I have been doing took me to see who had inspired the political discourse in the early 20th, maybe the second half of the 20th century, and found out that maybe some of this is not a kind of exhaustive research, but some of these guys were important in setting up that discourse, and you can see that there was a certain idea of equality, of equalizing gender, age, class, etc., etc. and yet I grew up in a time in which the people who were actually determining how we live had no political office, and yet I think have been incredibly powerful at shaping the world and shaping the politics, the power regimes where we operate. And it is interesting that they have all replaced equality by cheapness. Cheapness is also one of the themes that I am most interested in now, and in a way, some of also this research on the envelope is trying to find disciplines that escape from the position where architects like myself or the people in my generation have been educated to perform, which is to operate in that upper area. Architects in the past were supposed to make new worldviews, and that's where the value of experimental architecture was located. And I think by trying to address one particular issue of the building industry in a systematic manner related to politics, what I am more interested in doing, since this is already an oversubscribed club, is to engage in this world, which actually shapes, in this particular case, in the clothing industry, what people wear, 95% of people wear. That's where I think that the political opportunities are, and that happens not only in the clothing industry, which is closer to architecture, but in also in the airline world, for example, where we have the kind of glamour of the old airlines, expensive airlines, and the cheapness of JetBlue. I just flew in with JetBlue, which is fine. It's much better than EasyJet, by the way. What is interesting about this is that these people, like Sara, for example, the effect that Sara has had in Spain, is social effect, is remarkable. But in the same way, EasyJet has done great political actions, for example, by declassing the airline cabin. There are no classes any longer in this. So even if these people that I showed before are not claiming a political position, a political program, they are having a massive effect at shaping those politics, to the extent that now David Cameron in the UK, probably the future British Prime Minister, is getting the management experts of EasyJet to run the councils, and they are calling it the Easy Council. And in return, Ryanair is kind of using political imagery to make propaganda. Anyway, so this kind of blurring between politics and money, economies, is precisely the point where I would like to locate the research on the envelope, which is also a certain reflection on a kind of generational concern. I also grew in a generation that was the generation that became very early aware of global processes, and I used to show this slide trying to capture what David Harvey describes as the pillars or the mechanisms of flexible accumulation or late capitalism or global capital, which are mechanisms of spatial displacement, infrastructure, telecommunications, etc., mechanisms that allow to move people, move goods across the face of the earth, and mechanisms of temporal displacement, which is basically credit, mechanisms that enable you to advance or delay your financial obligations in time. And so we grew up in this world where we thought that we could move anywhere, the world was seamless, borderless, and we were very much interested in trying to capture that in architecture, this kind of fluid reality of global capitalism. And lately, what has happened is that those same mechanisms that we have used to construct the world where we live are now used to bomb cities, and you all know what has happened with credit systems recently. As a result of that, what I started to feel is that actually borders that were something that we thought had disappeared are emerging, re-emerging with a virulence that didn't exist before. And I mean, this is the American Embassy in London, protectionism. So borders are re-emerging. Borders, limits are a new problem that at least my generation was not concerned with, because we were concerned in embodying flows and embodying liquid forms, and Yokohama is very much a kind of exploration in that sense. And so, and there are other issues why limits are becoming important. The planet, we are realizing that the planet resources are finite. We know that we are walking towards the abyss if we continue consuming the amount of energy we are consuming and producing the carbon emissions that we are producing. And actually, most of these things are resolved, are addressed in the problem of the envelope of the building. Basically, the envelope of the building accounts for 70% of the possibilities that you have, or not 70, I say 70, but for a very large percentage of the possibilities that you have to regulate the energy exchanges between the outside of the building and the inside of the building. That's why I also thought that this other new consciousness was adding even more reasons why, if we want to be relevant in the next few decades, the key issue that we need to investigate is the issue of the border, of the envelope, of the limit of the building. And so we have to come to terms with the fact that we don't live in a borderless world. What is happening now is that the world is systematically reconstituting borders. There are no longer the old borders, but there are new borders, and we need to determine them. So that's why I propose this experiment of trying to develop a new theory of the envelope that basically comes to say that if in the past architects were primarily using the plan and the section to make their political stance, the panopticon or the pilotis and the plan libre are a very good examples of how architectural devices were at some point invested with political content. I think that in the next few years we probably need to bring together theories of representation and technologies of environmental performance into a new theory that can bring those two things together. And as a hypothesis, which is obviously a test, is not a finished theory. What I am trying to do, and what I'm going to use as the backbone of the explanation of our projects, is the idea that envelopes. I mean, there has been in the last few years also a lot of interest in the field of architecture about the surface as a problem. And by talking about the envelope rather than talking about the surface, what I'm trying to do is to expand that definition. I'm not concerned with the patterns of the surface or how to produce the patterns of the surface. I'm not concerned about the surfacial effects that we can produce. We know we can produce these things. I think what is crucial to address is the relationship between those patterns, those systems of construction, and the massing of the buildings, the aspect ratios of the building. So the theory is that we can actually draw links between between the aspect ratio of an envelope, and I'm talking again as an envelope as the sum of the facades and the roof. Another one of the things that has happened is that right now building technologies are treating facades and roofs increasingly in a more similar way. So try to theorize the envelope by keeping that separation, I think is probably not the right way to address it, and that's why I'm looking at the buildings as enclosures that contain certain potentials that have to be explored and can be related between the way we treat the surface and this aspect ratio of the enclosures. So there are four types that I call flat, horizontal, and this is basically my hypothesis, and probably it's an incomplete hypothesis. It needs to be developed, but that's where I start from. There is flat horizontal envelopes, flat vertical envelopes, spherical envelopes, and vertical envelopes. And those are the four basic categories in which I'm trying to structure this theory of the building envelope that hopefully will bring together surfacial concerns with climatic problems, with representational problems, and hopefully political opportunities. So flat horizontal envelopes are envelopes like this one. They are not new in the history of architecture. They have a very long tradition, sometimes utopian. So all these buildings that contain large spaces and that basically cover a large piece of the ground have also certain interesting potentials. The most important ones are that because the roof suddenly becomes the main surface of the envelope, it needs to be articulated in such a way that regulates light and ventilation, and in some ways conditions the interior of the space. Is the roof that becomes the main device to relate outside and inside, natural and artificial, and what is interesting, as I think, as a perhaps political opportunity, is the fact that these buildings are usually so large that sometimes, or very often, even if in a picturesque manner, they have to decide whether nature is inside or outside. And it's very common. You go to airports, you go to shopping malls, and there is some attempt always to replicate nature inside. by putting bamboo gardens or these kind of little demonstrations of nature that you find inside of the airport. So the roof is making the border between the inside and the outside, but it's also making certain statements about the artificial and the natural. And it gets even more complex when these buildings become so large and the technologies of roofing become also naturalized, that these buildings start behaving as a ground, and therefore open another, I think, political potential, which is the manipulation of the ground, the destabilization or restabilization of the ground as a political opportunity. Because these type of buildings are have a very important function inside, they usually have a very low level of determination of the vertical edge. So there is basically nothing that we can do as architects other than adding a billboard or changing the color of the things to make it look as if we have done architecture. But basically there is neither climatic performance that is very relevant in that peripheral wall, nor any attempt to relate between inside and outside, because actually what these buildings are often trying to do is to contain something that is self-contained and as detached as possible from the outside. So 2 projects from the office to talk about this issue, and I would like to say that I'm using the projects of the work of the office to explain this, but I don't want you to think that they are exemplary in any way. They are probably the indexes where I've been able to identify those potentials. And maybe there are timid attempts within the limits of the projects to address some of these issues. This is a shopping center finished in Umraniye in Istanbul 2 or 3 years ago. In this location, on the Asian side, infrastructural node next to IKEA. IKEA is the prototype of the flat horizontal envelope, the most paradigmatic example of the flat horizontal envelope, which is this kind of abstract box that is deployed onto the ground with no attempt whatsoever to mediate with the ground, and with no attempt either to produce any relationship between the inside and the outside. And so, in a way, this project became an exercise to criticize the status quo of these blank boxes. That's the ground before we made the building. That's the wall, the party wall of IKEA. And what was interesting was to realize that the ground was basically clay, was red earth. And then looking at old pictures of Istanbul, we realized that Istanbul is a city of green and red, because of it's a very green city. It has this kind of clay ground, and if we were trying to challenge the status quo of this deployed box on the land, perhaps one of the possibilities was actually to use the palette of the ground, to merge the project with the ground in the way in which IKEA doesn't do it, and by doing so, hopefully try to destabilize the ground, to make something new of this ground that IKEA also doesn't relate to, doesn't destabilize or stabilize or does anything. The ground is irrelevant. So here it was a problem of using the envelope to produce that new ground. We propose a green, it's a super green building. We managed to convince the client to split it into pieces and have a central square inside. We use a green roof that is obviously has certain advantages in terms of thermal performance and hydraulic cycle and so on and so forth. And so the building that we developed, as opposed to what IKEA does, this is IKEA, and this is our building. So what we did was to blend the roof and the ground and locate this central public space that in the future, once the city grows around this currently suburban location, it could actually become a new square for the for the community. I'm not going to explain but so you see the palette of materials. It's a very rough building. We had a minor engagement with the construction, but that was also part of the problem. We had to set up a very simple set of requirements that will have the effect that we were trying to achieve without having to be on top of it very much. And so these are some of the pictures. It's horribly built. Therefore, but never mind. I mean, the ideas, most of the ideas are there, even if the details are usually crap. I think that's also about talking about cheapness, how to operate with these cheap opportunities that I think constitute today 90% or 95% of the work that architects have and are taking as irrelevant endeavors because they are not expensive, they are not well considered. I think actually those are the places where we can make important differences. Daylight and natural ventilation are used also as a way of shaping the landscape in the roof. I mean, you see this is what the way that the building feels. These people don't know, but they are walking on an unstable ground. And actually, what happens inside of the square is quite remarkable because suddenly it becomes a stage for different activities that are organized by, supported by the developers. Second project is a project that we are doing now. Is also a cheap project. Is the redevelopment of this building, which is Birmingham New Street Station. Right in the middle of Birmingham is an old building from the 70s that is being now revamped at a huge cost and at the cost of £390 million. But our commission, and that's why I say this could be a fantastic project, kind of civic pride and all these things are obviously in the menu, but the commission that we get is to design the facade, to make some kind of image for a refurbishment that is actually being done by another architect. So from these 390 million, we have more or less 40 million. But this 40 million is where the image of the building has to be located. So it was a very difficult project to address because it's as you can see, it's a blank building, and in fact, it has a shopping mall inside, and we were explicitly told not to try to make any connections between the inside and the outside. The shopping mall had to remain there, working as it was, and nobody wanted to be disturbed with the application of this new envelope. So we started thinking, so how do we, because normally architects, when we do envelopes, we try to communicate it inside and outside and express certain things about that communication, but in this case, that communication was forbidden from day one. So we started thinking, well, what can we do? Birmingham is a city that is like a hub city located in the Midlands that emerges out of crossing of paths and canals and this kind of density of flow, and the station is obviously part of that that flow. But so what we thought was that maybe we should celebrate we should use the station as a way of celebrating this quality of Birmingham as a flow city. And there were a number of things that are happening in the center of the city that we could use to mobilize certain identities, both of Birmingham and New Street Station. The clouds, Birmingham used to have a famously black sky because of the steel industry and the generally bad weather. And now it has a beautiful sky because there is global warming and the steel industry has moved to Korea. So it's a time to celebrate the sky, it's a time to celebrate the trains that are sunken underground and invisible. It's a time to celebrate the lights, the lights, the information lights. So we basically devised this kind of quadriptycho of flows that are happening on the side that we try to capture in this new scheme. The trains, the crowds of commuters going in and out is one of the busiest stations in Europe, the bands of information and the sky. And we do that by wrapping the building with a skin that is reflective and that is designed to reflect exactly those things, not to reflect the buildings in front, like the 70s buildings, but actually to reflect the sky, to reflect the public space, to admit the screens so that the building becomes a demonstration and a mix of all these things. We like to talk about Koyaanisqatsi, no? The movie where you see cars moving and clouds moving and processes happening simultaneously as a kind of demonstration of the energy of the of the city. So we instead of looking inwards from the envelope, we looked outwards. We scanned the field around the station with a series of sections that identify the depth from which the building is seen, and you see what happens. We put the people, the different viewpoints, and we calculate the inclination of those envelopes so that we reflect exactly the things that we wanted to reflect. So sometimes you have a very deep field, sometimes you have the trains below that you want to reflect, sometimes you have, and so with all these sections we just morph them, and that's what created the form of this envelope that is supposed to represent the station and represent maybe Birmingham as a city that has this particular past, but it's all like something attached to the building. We are not looking inside, we are only looking outside. I think what is interesting about this envelope and the cheapness in which we have to operate is precisely that cheapness forces us to invent perhaps an alternative to more conventional types of facades. This is the way, it's actually a huge thing. These are the mock-ups of the buildings. It's like 19,000 square meters of stainless steel, and this is the effect that we hope the building will have. It will be almost like a device that will enable the citizens to witness and to experience the different lighting conditions or the different flows that are going in and out of the station through the day. Some more images about the building and an animation that tries to explain. You see, from ground level you never see the trains, but it is precisely because the facade is reflecting and is pointing down that you see the trains and you see the commuters moving and you see the clouds moving, and you have this kind of synthesis of flows in the center of Birmingham. I'm not going to finish this. Let's move on to the next category, which is the category of spherical, trying to honor this an important inspiration in this research, which is Peter Sloterdijk trilogy of the spheres, which I'm fortunate enough to be able to read in Spanish. So spherical buildings doesn't mean that they are spherical. It means that they have a more or less an equidistant or even dimension in all aspects. So the height, the depth, and the width of the building is more or less the same. So this is a spherical building, this is a spherical building, this is a spherical building, whether you believe it or not. This is also a spherical building because it has this spherical building in the sense I'm using the term here. And I think that what is in spherical buildings have a long tradition of engagement with the representation of political ideas or ideologies, primarily because they are buildings that are difficult to function without air conditioning. They don't ventilate, you cannot lead them inside, you need to develop a kind of artificial climate inside, and that's why they became so rare, and they are often used as ways of showing utopias or worlds in themselves. Spherical buildings have actually the lowest envelope ratio of all, because a sphere contains more space per more cubic meters per square meter of surface. That means that in a way what happens in a building like this is that the facade is freer from any determination, any internal determinations than in other typologies, and yet they are buildings that are usually that usually have a very important iconographic content. They are public buildings. They are buildings that often mix different types of spaces. Some of them are not related to the outside. Some of them are related to the outside. So they enable architects they push architects to engage into a kind of experimentation that is to a degree about pure treatment of the surface. The surface is no longer a crucial climatic device, and therefore it becomes a domain for experimentation. And so architects now have all kinds of CNC technologies and silk screening technologies and casting technologies that are being explored in this type of buildings. And it's actually quite interesting because this is a kind of sample of all these buildings. What you see in all of them is a deliberate attempt to make differentiated patterns. So there is a certain political unconscious that is happens in China, but happens in Japan and happens here in Europe that drive architects to explore with this type of patterns. That's just kind of a side comment. So two buildings that are not that spherical, but unfortunately we used to have one spherical building, which is the Institute of Legal Medicines, but that stopped. We basically pulled out. That was too cheap to continue. So now I'm going to show two facades that are for buildings that are more or less within that type of envelopes that enclose a space that is equidistant in all dimensions. One of them is this building, John Lewis. We had to do that project there as part of development in Leicester. Nothing to talk about the inside. Again, cheap projects. We don't even we are not allowed to question how a cinema complex works or how a shopping department store works, because they know better than us how they work. So they tell us what to do, and we are left with the design of the facade as the main area of application of our discipline. So in that situation, we again try to make that envelope attached to. Attached is a word from Bruno Latour that I like very much because. And I like very much in respect to the issue of the envelope, because the surface is by itself, but the envelope is always attached. It's attached to the outside of the building, it's attached to the inside of the building, it's attached to cultural concerns, iconographic concerns, environmental concerns, and so on and so forth. So in a way, the project of the envelope is a project of being able to produce or to explore expression of these attachments of the surface. So in this case, Leicester is an industrial city with a huge amount of Asian population and a tradition of this type of hosiery, and so what we proposed was to capitalize on that tradition and replace the wall of enclosure of the store with this complex skin of 2 layers of glass. This is actually not cheap. But we were lucky enough that the client bought it, and so what we did was to take a pattern that was from the archive of John Lewis, who was the final tenant for the building. We selected a pattern based on the coverage of the pattern because we were interested in a certain amount of G value, shading coefficient of the facade in order to achieve certain environmental performance, and then we redrew it, and we redrew it in a way that by having these 8 different tiles, we can shift the transparency slightly. So it's a pattern that appears continuous. It's actually discontinuous because there are unitized glazing systems, but by printing that pattern on the glass, we are erasing the joints and turning it into a monolith that then has a pattern that is differentiated. If you think about that kind of political unconscious that I was mentioning before, of facades that are at once monolithic and differentiated, like in Beijing, this is part probably of that same attempt of capturing that political unconscious. So the pattern was scaled up for ergonomic reasons so that it will embrace the heads of the people inside, and it has, because it's double, it has an interesting effect, which is that when you are inside, you see through, but you see through, but when you are outside, you don't see because the 2 patterns overlap. And cut the light also. Every time that the light moves diagonally through the envelope, it overlaps. Every time that the light moves horizontally, like when you are looking from inside, it's more transparent. So that is also some of the effects that were produced in this building that, as you can see, picks up, sometimes reflects, because it's a reflective silk screening, the one that we perform on the glass. It makes the divisions of the cladding disappears. It captures the light and the shadow. It makes some areas transparent and opaque, depending on how the light around the building is. It acts as a kind of Chinese lantern at night, changes colors. Next spherical project that is now nearing completion in front of the Dome in Greenwich for a College of Design and Communication. We were given a very simple shape that was derived from the fact that we had to relate to the dome, so we had to either do a crescent or a chevron-like form that could be a school but could also be an office building, that because of the funding of the project, etc. So anyway, we had to do this type of building. There are some ideas that I'm not going to discuss about shifting levels, but what is important about this project is that in this case we were trying to capture the identity of Ravensbourne College, which is an offspring of the arts and crafts in England. William Morris. We had to stand in front of the dome, which is a huge mass with no scale, and so the idea was that what we were going to do was some sort of silo, wallpaper silo, where as opposed to what happens in schools, which is that you see always the stratification of the different floors. We were trying to destratify those floors, first of all by doing what I showed you before of using a system of split levels that enhances the diagonal movement through the building, and then making that pattern of perforations that will turn the building into some kind of mysterious mass where you don't know any longer where the floors are located or what is happening behind. And we did that by resorting not to flowers but to tile that is derived from Penrose tiling, non-periodic tiling system that uses 3 pieces, a triangle, a fat pentagon, and a thin pentagon. That's how they call them. And that covers the surface in this way and enables us to have different sizes of perforations. And so these are different types of perforations. And then what happens, you see the split levels. You see that the floors change, and between 2 floors we always have 2 lines of windows, because when the floor changes to the split level, suddenly, and so that's the way in which we blur from the facade the presence of the floors that is characteristic of school typologies and form that very abstract mass in front of the dome. And what we did here is to identify the programs within that volume and also the exposure to the sun, and use that as a determination of the size of the windows that had to be used around the building that allowed to produce different lighting effects. And so what is interesting about this also is that there is a complete, it looks as a kind of ornamental building, but actually the attachment between that pattern and the size, the floor-to-floor height, and the floor grids is absolutely exact. The distance of the floors has to be 4.594, because otherwise we cannot match. We cannot have 180 meters for the low windows when we have low windows, and we cannot match the floor grids. The pattern in some ways determines the position of the section and everything else. And the pattern changes, as you can see, every time that the perforation changes. Maybe there are better images here. You see when the perforation becomes bigger or smaller, the tiles are coded in such a way that they relate to the polar, the center of the polar array. And as the things change, the pattern around these windows also vary. And so this is this facade towards the dome, and this is the building now nearly finished. You see basically how every time that the window is different, what happens around the window changes automatically colors. This is the atria inside. I'm not going to basically, these are the perforations of the atria and how the windows appears. The windows appear in those perforations. Large facade. Flat vertical. I have 2 more categories. Do I have time, or I'm like over the top? Okay. 45 minutes late, you said? Okay. Okay, flat vertical. Flat vertical typologies are what is commonly known as slabs. And what is interesting about slabs is that they constitute 95% of the typologies, urban typologies built after the Enlightenment. So they are an effective floor depth or bay depth that optimizes daylight and ventilation for a particular use, and then they are densified, and that's why they produce slabs or bent slabs or these kind of organizations that we know make the cities where we live, as opposed to the old cities, which is this Le Corbusier drawing that talks about how those patterns of flat vertical organizations unfold into new future organizations that I think is quite interesting to explain the concept. One of the most important things about this typology is that it has that very important urban performance. And this is Toulouse-les-Mirailles, a city that was built, it was a major disaster in the outskirts of Toulouse by Candilis, Josic, and Woods, where you see, as opposed to what we were seeing in Barcelona or in, I don't know, in Buenos Aires, and in the traditional cities where the flat envelope is delimiting private and public. In these modern cities that Le Corbusier starts, there is no longer back or front or public or private. The ground in this kind of welfare state has become all pervading, is all public, and therefore there is no point of establishing those differentiations. And so in the way in which these typologies are deployed onto the ground, we can produce incredibly important effects. So there are other examples of these typologies in action also failed, perhaps because they failed to make something that was seen as anti-democratic when these things were built, which is to accept that it's important that in cities parts of the ground are private. And so in being able to establish the patterns in which we deploy these typologies and we use them to divide public and private, I think there are some of the most important potentials of these typologies. The other important potential, we talk about politics, is that in this typology, the envelope, as opposed to what was happening in the spherical types, performs at the same time very important environmental functions and very important iconographic or representational functions, and both coincide in the envelope. So shades, types of fenestration, and so the history of architecture is full of examples of how the flat vertical types represents cells or a kind of building built by accretion of units, or as opposed to that, an envelope or a building built by repetition of building components that gives priority to that surfacial entity. And again, we go back to these are contemporary attempts to deal with the problem, and you see that as opposed to these Miesian and Corbusian types in which everything was being repetitive, that also as this kind of political unconscious, contemporary political unconscious, is no longer possible to make a building like this. It's just politically incorrect. You are seen as sort of a fascist because you are equalizing everybody. And so now all architects are trying to change something so that there is some kind of and so the way in which we manage the relationship between that latent unconscious desire of differentiation as a quality that we all aspire to in our contemporary societies, and how this differentiation fits into programs that are usually quite repetitive is actually quite interesting. So in this sense, I bring again two projects. This one made in the outskirts of Madrid for social housing, where we were giving the freedom to locate our building in that site, and there was supposed to be a park. So we decided to concentrate all the mass in one bay facing the park, so that and make all the units through units, so that on one side they will look onto the park, and on the other side they will look onto a private park that is the cover of the parking. The building was limited to a certain height, and that immediately took us to a very deep building in order to locate or to host all the units in that front. And once we did that, we realized that because we had a very low facade ratio, we could perhaps think in the possibility of making an all-glass social housing building. That was the kind of idea that we started with, which was this thing. But then we realized that in Madrid, in a kind of east-west orientation, that was going to be an oven. So we decided to cover it with a skin that will contain a buffer zone of terraces. You see that all the typologies are through, enjoying the private park and the public park, but also producing cross ventilations and producing this kind of tubular units that have very small facade. It's almost as if a conventional social housing facade, we had concentrated, packed all the windows in one area and stretched the type so that we have only windows on two sides. That's how these typologies are created, always double aspect, etc., etc. And so this is the kind of invention, which is this folding screen that we derived from some local traditional prototypes of solar shading devices, and that at some point we thought it would be an interesting idea to use bamboo, to use a very cheap material to instead of using zinc, perforated zinc, which is what we originally thought. We convinced the client to use this. And so that's how this solid block with folding screens work. And you see the conventional typologies trying to differentiate. I think what is interesting about this for me, or the achievement that I see here, is the possibility of producing that differentiation, but not by forcefully painting things with a different color or introducing interesting details to make that the expression of the building, but using the environmental desires of the different inhabitants inside of the building to produce this varying pattern and yet consistent in its nature and its detail. This is how these galleries work when they are closed and when they are open. Next project, also part of the kind of flat horizontal office complex in the city of London, in this location, very disorganized fabric. Basically, the client told us to make 3 central core office blocks that were limited in height by view corridors and other complex regulations that we have to endure in London. This is the first default extrusion of the site into these 3 buildings, and then the chiseling of these extrusions in order to allow more daylight to the neighboring fabric or self-protect the facades to the south. A number of manipulations of those basic extrusions that we went through, and then we regulated by the fact that we knew that we needed to use a unitized glazing system or facade system to wrap those envelopes, and the possibility of making integer numbers or integer cuts of those units is what finally fixes the geometry of those envelopes that have this kind of curious gem-like quality, and that therefore we needed to build in these are the buildings. This is kind of totally conventional central core buildings, but we basically needed to use glass in order to have this kind of gem-like quality, and glass has the problem that it is not very environmentally conscious and efficient, and so we started researching on how to shade the glass and use the shading, the kind of environmental performance of that facade in order to produce or one of the important architectural expressions of the building. So these surfaces, these irregular forms, were studied by our environmental engineers, and we were given different percentages of shading that we had to provide. And then with an integer number of tiles that were fritted depending on the pattern that we wanted to achieve, we could produce these gradated systems of shading around the envelopes. This is how the buildings will look like when they come back to the market, because at the moment are on hold. It's an atrium. I mean, nothing. Maybe what I brought is, I don't know if this is gonna work. No, sorry. There's quite an interesting animation of this, but let's move to the last typology, which is the vertical type. Vertical type is interesting, I think, in terms of political effect, because it is the typology that has the most important presence as a kind of iconography or image, but at the same time it has also the most stringent requirements in terms of environmental performance. These are expensive buildings that need to be that need to be very carefully measured. So at the same time, you have this incredible political opportunity on the to express a certain even national program, like in the case of these buildings. That is North Korea, Pyongyang. So I mean, you have this kind of situations where you see a very efficient form then being clad with an image, and that relationship between the image and the environmental performance is, I think, what is most interesting. Environmental performance. This is Hong Kong, where the envelope is actually not trying to be iconic or iconographic in any sense. Is the pure embodiment of efficiencies of daylight and ventilation. Every room has to be ventilated. Every room has to have daylight, and therefore you end up in these incredibly complex envelopes that have a certain performance, and that's how they are organized. So between those buildings and these buildings, there is the tension where I think that I think we can explore as a field of political opportunity. Other examples of towers. This is Dubai. So you see between these type of buildings where nature is embedded into the envelope. I mean, the interest of Hong Kong and Southeast Asia is that culturally, climatically first, because it's a humid climate that needs ventilation, but also culturally, Asians don't like domestic spaces that do not have a very close relationship with nature, as opposed to Middle Easterns or Westerners, where high-rise living in the United States is about air conditioning and mechanical ventilation of the toilets and pressurizing of the cores and totally artificial devices that are actually keeping the building alive out of consuming energy. So the opportunity is actually to measure that possibility of engaging nature with the building is, I think, also a very important potential of these typologies. Other possibilities, shading the outside, as a determination. I think that we live in a time in which it's almost like we can do anything, and actually what we need to perhaps start to find out is what we should not do. And in a way, this research, this is our own research on envelope ratios, where you see buildings in Korea or buildings in the UK having ratios of from 0.38 square meters to a square meter of floor, to buildings in Southeast Asia where you have 0.84 square meters per floor. That is a number that probably developers and people who are in the building industry know very well. Architects know nothing or cannot use them effectively. And I think that is a type of investigation that I am particularly interested in, because these numbers express the level of artificiality of the space inside. So some examples two examples. I'm going to explain quickly two examples of how we have explored in the past the articulation between efficiency and expression as a trying to regain again consistency in these typologies that now are often delivered by totally independent professionals. Some people does the core, other does the layout of the floor plates, and somebody else comes and wraps around with a funky facade. So in a way, the project that I'm interested in and that I am engaged in is the project of resetting those attachments that will make the envelope perform again, not just as a decoration of a skin. World Trade Center competition, not competition actually, that was the commission from Max Protege, and that was our proposal, which was to split the mass of the two towers into these 6 towers that had the size of an average lease of offices in Manhattan at the time, and bending the towers so that they will buttress each other and therefore hopefully inaugurate a new typology of high-rise that by shaping the envelope has more capacity to keep growing higher and also producing certain lobby effects. But in a way, it's a kind of envelope used in this case for structural efficiency, but at the same time resonating with certain messages that were very much part of what had to be communicated in these projects. You know, these images of people building together something almost like physically were very much part of the iconography that we had to make resonate with those structural concerns. And the last project is a project that is now again on hold, but hopefully restarting soon in KL, a commercial cheap project again. What is interesting about this project, and perhaps I should have brought others, but there were too many projects, but towers are the envelopes that are probably most exposed or most affected by solar radiation, because they have a huge surface that is hit by the sun constantly. Probably also flat horizontal have a similar effect. So what was interesting about this project was that we were working in the equator, and when you work in the equator, it's hot and you don't want to get the sun. So the sun actually is moving right above you. You are, as opposed to what happens in the northern or southern hemisphere where the sun is moving around, in the equator is moving above, and you don't want the sun. So what ends up happening, this is the solar diagram. This is very disorganized, sorry. What ends up happening is that there are some slides missing here. sorry. These buildings are basic. I don't know whether there is a plan of the buildings. Yeah. So what ends up happening is that you want to have buildings oriented north-south, as opposed to what happens when you work in the northern or southern hemispheres, where you want the mass to be more compact, more concentrated, and hopefully oriented to the south. So we developed these typologies, those kind of relatively or very conventional typologies in KL, with the parameters of providing daylight to and ventilation to every one of the units, and therefore this labyrinthic type of corrugation of the facade that is the direct product of addressing those environmental concerns. But you can see, for example, that the core is open, is not pressurized, is not ventilated, is not conditioned, and therefore it doesn't consume energy. The higher capital costs that buildings that have a more complex facade have in respect to more simple facades actually can produce a lower maintenance and a more efficient energy management for the building. And that's I think the type of shading, self-shading devices, canopies that are designed in terms of the orientation of the face, but also in terms of the function of the room that they are protecting. And that became the language that produces the expression of the building. So that is a detail of how that facade will be built, and these effects of changing in the section. I didn't explain it, but it was at the beginning in a disorganized way. The section, the types of apartments change. So in a way, that again ambition of a differentiated but consistent expression of the community that is inhabiting the building is also very much part of this project. I think, as I said before, I think I had more projects, but I think that I already told you enough for you to understand what this project of the envelope is, and I thank you for your patience, and if you want to have questions, I'm very happy to answer them. Thank you. Yeah.
I have to see the building and think rootlessness to make the connection to politics. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about how you think pattern and surfaces actually work. How do they actually engage social questions experientially?
Well, you know, I mean, the whole issue of affect is very interesting, because I think that what some theorists have described that as the non-representational theory. Nigel Thrift and all these people are been talking about a type of politics that are played no longer on a dialectic level, but on an affective level. I mean, what's Brian Masumi talking about Ronald Reagan as the epitome of the affective politician who doesn't really engage in a discourse, but actually conveys a certain message by his own presence almost, is probably what would be a clearest example of how buildings produce messages, convey messages that are almost subliminal. And it's true that in the text of the envelope, of the politics of the envelope, or the pattern one, for me, many of these possibilities are allegorical. I accept it, and I think that probably those are the most effective tools that we have as architects to engage with this type of politics. I'm fascinated by the fact that all the buildings that were built for the Beijing Olympics were commissioned to very important names, and they all ended up being a differentiated, consistent pattern. The CCTV, the stadium, the water cube. No matter what architect is operating, is somehow receiving the message from the Chinese authorities that they want to portray themselves not as the heritage of Mao and the blue suit, where everything is the same, but they want to portray themselves as a culture that is capable of engage massive projects and yet be sensitive to difference. So it is allegorical, but probably there are effects that are produced by the pure performance of the facade that are not amenable to an allegorical to an iconography of how the society is organizing. The NVRDB building, for example, the NVRDB facade is also a building that is exploring difference in a way, exploring the effect of difference, exploring a message of saying we are free, we are an integrating community, we are welcoming, we are everybody can do what they want here. So there are all these messages that are being played out in a kind of latent manner that I think architecture unveils, or can unveil. And then there are other effects that are probably more difficult to pin down, that have to do with a certain experiential impression that you receive. But I don't know how to address them. I mean, that's why I don't theorize them, because when I can, I know that buildings produce certain effects or of lightness or an interesting example, the new American embassy in London. You know this project, won by Kieran Timberlake a couple of weeks ago. It happens that as part of this research on the envelope in Princeton, one of the typologies that we were exploring was the typology of the embassy as one of the examples of the spherical envelope. Because embassies have a lot of stuff inside that don't need daylight, they are kind of secret, nearly military places with, and so they end up being quite fat buildings, quite spherical, if you want. And so the spherical group did a research on American embassies. There is a manual of how to do American embassies right now that very few people don't know, but it exists. And they found it. And they ended up proposing a building that was not in London, but it was an experiments with the issue of American embassies. And the issue of touching the ground, the building touching the ground, the building defining its pattern, the pattern that wraps around the building, the way the building delineates itself against the skyline. Those are moments in which you are giving messages. How does the American country lands on foreign ground? Well, the students, after doing some research, concluded that the American embassies, they were gradated. It's a pity. I could have brought these slides. That depending on the level of threat and the level of friendliness between the U.S. and other countries, the buildings needed to have a light touch. That's an effect. That is when the building is saying things subliminally, without debating them. But that's also what is dangerous about the effects, that are things that are like cocaine. They go straight to the brain. You don't have control of what they do to you. Some of these things you can identify, particularly in projects that are where effects are very very important. Otherwise, I don't know how else to use the term. I think it's a very difficult term to use. And that's probably why most of the examples that I end up coming up with are either resonances of political structures. So when you see that a facade with a pattern that is repetitive means equalitarian modular societies. Most American embassies from the 50s are like that. Curtain walls, screens, so that I think that there is a whole thing that you can investigate, and probably here I'm touching it in a few instances. I don't know whether I'm answering your question, or yeah.
I'd like to ask almost as a follow-up to this question. Would it be safe to say you sort of found a certain serialist strategy, which is the confluence of a positive and negative project, in that the positive project of using environmental envelope knowledge, what we know, requires differentiated repetitions to effectively engage sunlight or reflections or such, but then the negative project is in a sense using this exact same serialism, the differentiated repetition, to avoid any simple unity. And that in the surface, it's the confluence now of the sort of design intelligence project meets political project works. So my question then is, if surface has become this sort of new serial realm of where the patterns that couldn't evolve without the experimentation of the past 10, 15 years of kinds of computer graphics got us there, there's always the notion of the silhouette as opposed to the surface. And politically, it's the silhouette of the building that is always perhaps the thing that also has to either be engaged or avoided as, and maybe the surface is, I'm curious how you deal with the two, the silhouette versus the surface. We've seen a lot of...
The next project was about the silhouette. Because this was an interesting project. We were commissioned. I'm going to show you because I think it's very demonstrative of this. We were given the commission of, we entered a competition that was won by Cesar Pelli finally, to do the tallest building in Seville. The mayor wanted to say, I'm going to do the tallest building in this city, and there has been in that city there has been a regulation for centuries that no building can be taller than this. This was the tallest building in Europe for centuries, the Giralda. So we were told to locate that building in this place. I mean, you don't see it there, but there's absolutely no reason why you would put a 50-story building there. Financially, it didn't make any sense whatsoever. But that was the commission. Put a 50-story building in the Isla de la Cartuja because the mayor wants to say that he's built the tallest building in Seville, and Seville is a modern city. So, silhouette. We started investigating in the silhouettes that constantly, I mean, obviously when you make that statement and you want to relate to the city, you need to say, well, whatever building is there is going to be the new essence of Seville. So we went into kind of iconographic investigations of patterns, brick, flamenco dancing, curves. So then we ended up doing a building that was actually trying to make that moving silhouette by rotating a plan that was like a diamond. You see, it was a kind of conventional office building that we distort, and more or less we preserved most of the efficient qualities of space, and then we mediate between these diamonds, and that's what basically the plans do. Too many. But you are seeing basically as if you're going up the lift of the 50 stories, and and so the silhouette ends up being like this kind of dancer, unstable, covered with tiles that have to do with other local cultural traditions. So, I mean, I completely agree that the envelope in this case is formed by taking those plans that are a derivation of a conventional office plan and do something with them so that they end up producing effects that have to do with dynamism, instability, the pattern of the dancers with these polka dots dresses that they use, the tiling. So all these things I think have to do about conveying, in this case, an image, which I don't know whether it is an effect. It's more of an iconography, perhaps. I mean, there is an effect, perhaps, in the silhouette. There is an iconography, the use of an iconography of the tiles and the polka dot dresses and the lattices that are typical of Moorish architecture. Anyway, an opportunity to see another project.
Okay, if you have other questions for Alejandro, please join us downstairs.